Welcome to Phantom Realities, where fear takes on a life of its own. Tonight, we open the door to the unknown, sharing the true, chilling tales that linger in the dark corners of reality. From ghostly apparitions to whispers in the night, these are stories recounted by those who have faced the unexplainable and survived. Are you ready to step into their world, where shadows move, whispers echo, and terror awaits? Story 1: The Shadow at the Foot of the Bed. Sarah had always been a light sleeper. Even the faintest creak of the floorboards would rouse her from slumber. But that night, the silence in her bedroom was so thick, so unnervingly still, that it swallowed her whole. She woke up in the middle of the night, her body stiff and unmoving. Her eyes darted around the dimly lit room, taking in the shadows cast by the moonlight through her thin curtains. She tried to move her fingers, her toes, but it was as if her body had betrayed her. Then she saw it. At the foot of her bed, a shadow began to materialize. At first, she thought her mind was playing tricks on her, weaving illusions from the darkness. But the shadow grew, its form solidifying into a tall, featureless figure. It had no face, no features to distinguish it, yet Sarah felt its gaze pierce her. Fear rippled through her as she strained against the invisible force keeping her pinned to the bed. The shadow didn't move at first. It simply stood there, towering and oppressive. Sarah's breath quickened, though her chest remained frozen. Then, slowly, the figure tilted its head, as if studying her. It leaned closer, its presence cold and suffocating. A low whisper began to fill the room, a language she couldn't understand. It wasn't a voice, it was a vibration, resonating deep within her bones. She tried to scream, but her throat refused to cooperate. Her vision blurred as tears welled up. The shadow reached out, its hand hovering inches from her face. Just as she thought she would be consumed by its darkness, her phone buzzed loudly on the nightstand. The sudden sound shattered the moment, and she bolted upright, gasping for air. The room was bright with morning light, her heart racing as if she'd run a marathon. But as her eyes scanned the room, she noticed something that sent a chill down her spine. Her closet door, which she always kept closed, stood wide open. Her mind raced for an explanation, but nothing made sense. She checked her phone to confirm the time. It was 6 in the morning, the golden sunlight streaming through her window. Unable to shake the unease, Sarah cautiously approached the closet. Each step felt heavier than the last, her breath shallow. She reached for the handle, her fingers trembling. Swinging the door open, she found nothing unusual, her neatly arranged clothes and shoes stared back at her. Still, the weight of the night's terror clung to her. Something was wrong. As she closed the door, she noticed faint scratches on its inner side. They weren't there before. Sarah's day passed in a haze. Every noise, every shadow seemed amplified, sending waves of anxiety through her. She avoided her bedroom until it was time to sleep. Exhausted, she finally lay down, leaving the lamp on as a shield against the dark. Hours passed, and she drifted into an uneasy sleep. Then it happened again. She woke to the same suffocating weight, her limbs frozen in place. The shadow was back, standing at the foot of her bed. This time, it was closer, its head tilted as if mocking her. The whispering returned, louder and more distinct. She swore she heard her name woven into the unintelligible murmurs. Her eyes darted to the closet door, now ajar. The shadow noticed her gaze and slowly turned its head toward the closet. Panic surged through Sarah as the shadow began to move, its steps deliberate and soundless. It reached the closet and slipped inside. As it did, the door closed gently, as if it had never been opened. Sarah's paralysis broke, and she scrambled out of bed, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She flicked on every light in the room, throwing the closet door open. It was empty. Sarah decided she couldn't stay in the house. She packed a bag and drove to a friend's place, desperate for some semblance of safety. But even there, the unease lingered. She avoided sleeping, terrified of what might happen if she closed her eyes. When she finally succumbed to exhaustion, she dreamed of the shadow. It was always there, always waiting. Days turned into weeks, and Sarah's life unraveled. She couldn't work, couldn't focus, and the fear consumed her. She returned home to confront whatever it was, determined to reclaim her life. But as she stepped into her bedroom, the air grew cold, and the closet door slowly creaked open. The shadow emerged, and this time, it didn't stop. Story 2, The Watcher in the Corner. Michael had always been a skeptic. Ghost stories and supernatural tales were nothing more than campfire entertainment to him. But that changed one fateful night when he fell asleep on his couch after a long day at work. The glow of the television cast flickering shadows across the room as he drifted off. He woke to an eerie silence. The TV was off, the room pitch dark, and his body immobile. At first, he thought it was a dream. He tried to move, to sit up, but his limbs wouldn't obey. A cold dread began to settle over him as he became acutely aware of his surroundings. The faint sound of breathing that wasn't his own filled the room. His eyes darted to the corner, where a figure crouched in the shadows. It was humanoid, but wrong. Its limbs were too long, its posture unnaturally twisted. Two glowing eyes stared at him, unblinking. A jagged grin spread across its face, revealing rows of sharp teeth. Michael's heart pounded as the creature began to crawl toward him, its movements jerky, almost mechanical. It stopped inches from his face and whispered, "I've been waiting." Michael's panic reached a fever pitch as the lights flickered on. The creature vanished, leaving him gasping for air. But when he sat up, his eyes fell to the wooden floor. A faint scratch was etched into the surface, spelling out his name. The following nights were worse. The figure returned, always in the same corner. It never approached further than the first time, but its presence grew more oppressive. Michael couldn't ignore the icy chill that accompanied it. He avoided sleeping in the living room and even contemplated moving. But one night, in his bedroom, he woke to a familiar dread. The figure was there, at the foot of his bed this time. Its grin was wider, and the whispered words became clearer. "You can't run." Michael screamed, the paralysis breaking, but the figure didn't vanish. Instead, it lingered, staring until morning. Michael became obsessed with finding answers. He scoured forums and articles, searching for similar experiences. The descriptions matched: a shadowy entity known as the Watcher, tied to those who ignored its presence. Every story ended the same: the Watcher grew bolder until the victim disappeared. Michael's fear turned to resignation. He knew it wouldn't stop. One final night, Michael sat in his living room, waiting. The lights were off, the house silent. The Watcher emerged from the corner, its glowing eyes fixed on him. This time, Michael didn't fight. The last thing he heard was its voice, "You're mine now." Michael was never seen again. Story 3, The Woman in the Window. Leela always kept her curtains tightly drawn, fearing the vast overgrown garden outside her window. It wasn't just the eerie shapes of the trees at night or the rustling sounds from the bushes. It was the persistent feeling that something, or someone, might be watching her. For months, she had ignored this fear, dismissing it as paranoia. But one night, her worst nightmare unfolded. She awoke suddenly, her body frozen, unable to move even a finger. Her breaths came shallow and rapid as she scanned the room with darting eyes. The curtains were open. Her heart dropped. She was certain she had closed them before going to bed. Through the glass, a pale figure stared back at her. It was a woman, her features hollow and unnatural. Her hair hung in lifeless strands over her shoulders, and her eyes were empty, dark voids. Leela's paralysis deepened as a cold wave washed over her. The woman raised a finger to her lips, a shushing gesture that struck terror into Leela's core. Slowly, the figure began to move, not around the glass but through it. Her body seemed to melt into the room as if the barrier of the window didn't exist. She now stood by the bed, inches from Leela's face. Her pale, icy breath brushed against Leela's skin. A single word slipped from her bluish lips, "Mine." The next thing Leela knew, sunlight flooded her room. She shot up in bed, her limbs free again. Her curtains were closed, just as she had left them the night before. Had it all been a nightmare? She desperately wanted to believe so. But as she glanced at the window, her blood turned cold. A faint handprint lingered on the glass, pressed from the inside. Days passed, but the terror only grew. At night, the humming started. A soft, eerie tune that seemed to come from the garden. Leela avoided looking at the window, but the sensation of being watched never left her. One evening, she mustered the courage to peek outside. The garden was empty, bathed in moonlight. Yet her reflection in the window showed the woman standing behind her. Leela turned quickly, but no one was there. Her reflection, however, remained. The hollow-eyed woman stared back, now smiling. Leela shut her eyes, hoping to wake from the nightmare, but the reflection's voice filled the room, echoing softly. "Let me in." One night, she woke again to find the woman seated at the foot of her bed. "Why do you close the curtains?" the woman asked, her voice almost childlike. Leela tried to scream but couldn't. The woman reached out and placed an icy hand on her leg. "You can't keep me out." When Leela woke the next morning, she was curled on the floor, her body aching as if she had been dragged there. The curtains were open again. The faint handprint on the glass was now smeared, as though someone had tried to force their way in. Story 4: The Silent Stranger. Tom was used to sleeping with his bedroom door tightly shut. It was an old habit that made him feel secure. His small apartment was quiet, the kind of silence that felt more comforting than unsettling. But one night, that silence was shattered. It began with a faint noise, almost like a whisper. Tom stirred but didn't wake fully. It wasn't until he heard the unmistakable sound of the door creaking open that his eyes snapped wide. He tried to sit up, but his body refused to move. Panic set in as he realized he was completely paralyzed. Standing in the doorway was a man. His figure was cloaked in shadows, but his outline was clear. He wore a long, tattered coat and a wide-brimmed hat that obscured his face. The man stepped into the room, his movements eerily deliberate, yet completely silent. He stopped just short of the bed and tilted his head, as if studying Tom. The stranger leaned forward, his face still hidden. Tom's breath caught as a cold hand rested on his chest. The touch was icy, and it spread a deep chill through his entire body. The man's voice was low and hollow as he whispered, "Not yet." Just as suddenly as he had appeared, the man straightened and stepped back into the shadows, vanishing without a sound. When Tom regained his ability to move, he bolted upright, gasping for air. The door was shut tight, just as he'd left it. He spent the rest of the night with the lights on, too terrified to close his eyes. He tried to convince himself it was a dream, but deep down, he knew it wasn't. Over the next few nights, Tom noticed strange things. His door would be slightly ajar when he woke up, even though he was certain he'd closed it. Small, muddy footprints began to appear on his floor, leading to his bed. The air in his room grew colder, and the feeling of being watched became unbearable. One night, he woke to the same paralysis. The man was back, this time closer. Tom could make out more details now, the frayed edges of his coat, the glint of something metallic in his hand. The man whispered the same words, "Not yet," before vanishing again. Desperate, Tom set up a camera to record himself while he slept. The next morning, he hesitated to watch the footage. But when he did, his blood ran cold. The man was there, standing over him for hours, unmoving. And then, just before dawn, he leaned down and whispered something directly into Tom's ear. Tom never found out what the man had said. He moved out of the apartment that very day, leaving everything behind. But even in his new home, the whispers began again. Story 5: The Whispering Twins. Emma was excited to move into her grandmother's old Victorian house. It was the kind of place with creaky floors and rooms that seemed to hold secrets. She spent her first few nights unpacking and settling in, but something about the attic made her uneasy. It wasn't just the cobwebs or the old, dusty furniture, it was the dolls. They were porcelain, with painted faces that stared blankly into the room. Emma had considered throwing them out, but something stopped her. She didn't believe in ghosts, but it felt wrong to disturb them. That was her first mistake. One night, she woke suddenly, unable to move. At first, she thought it was the weight of her blankets pinning her down, but then she heard it, a soft giggle. Her eyes darted around the room, landing on two small figures standing at the foot of her bed. They were children, or at least they looked like children. Their skin was pale, their eyes dark voids. They tilted their heads in unison and smiled. "Play with us," one of them whispered. The other climbed onto the bed, its movements jerky and unnatural. Emma tried to scream, but her voice was trapped in her throat. The second figure reached out, its cold hand brushing against her leg. "It's our turn," it said, leaning closer. Just as Emma thought she would lose her mind, the room filled with light. The figures vanished, and she bolted upright. Morning had come, but her relief was short-lived. Tiny handprints covered the dust on her floor, leading to the attic. Emma avoided the attic for weeks, but the whispers didn't stop. "Play with us," they repeated, night after night. Finally, she gathered the courage to face whatever was haunting her. She climbed the creaking stairs to the attic and found the dolls arranged in a perfect circle, their faces turned toward the center. Before she could react, the door slammed shut behind her. She spun around, but there was no one there. The giggling grew louder, echoing in the confined space. The dolls' heads turned to face her, their painted smiles now grotesque. Emma doesn't remember how she escaped the attic that night. She woke up in her bed, covered in scratches and bruises. The attic door was locked, and the key was nowhere to be found. She moved out the next day, leaving the house and its secrets behind. But the whispers followed. You just glimpsed the terrifying truths that hide in the shadows, but there's so much more waiting to be uncovered. Phantom Realities is your gateway to the stories that haunt the bravest souls. If tonight's tales kept you on edge, subscribe and join us again as we dive deeper into the spine-chilling accounts that define the unknown. Until then, stay safe, and remember, not all whispers are in your head.